أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه وخاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيد الأولين والآخرين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. It's a lot of rain today. Maybe it's appropriate for Karbala, as you know in the ahadith, that the heavens, the earth, the skies cried for Hussein alayhi salam. Salawat. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have tackled quite a few themes in these last sort of 6 lectures, 5-6 lectures, and we dealt with the idea that within systems and ideas, although of course a lot of systems and ideas are positive, as we have discussed, some things can be very negative and some things can be unjust, like we saw within human rights and human rights being abused. In the last 2 lectures, I now introduced a different theme, which is within education and intellectuality, how can people create strategies of injustice? So if you remember yesterday, we saw how the media and some politicians says that the Quran is a barbaric and violent book, and alhamdulillah we have Imam alayhi salam's beautiful response in Nahj al-Balagha, but perhaps we haven't used it. Now in this lecture I want to continue exploring Nahj al-Balagha to see how it can respond to some new intellectual strategies of injustice which are to do with education. The way in which education is used to create some kind of dhulm, to create separation between religion and secular education, the way in which education is commercialized, the way in which education, I'm talking about universities and schools, the way in which education becomes very political. All of these are actually strategies of injustice, because they stop us from learning sincerely. If you, for example, say that education is all about money, and a student has to pay high fees, and a student has to get a job afterwards, of course, one has to provide for the family. But then you lose that thirst for seeking knowledge. If you say that education is political, that you have to study the American style of education, or British style, or Iranian, or Iraqi style of education, if you already put governments or political ideas within education, then you are teaching somebody to only think of life and society and people in one particular way, right? But if you say, look, it doesn't matter, education is free, knowledge is free, nobody can control ideas, no scholar, no school of thought, no country, no government can ever control knowledge. Why? Because Allah is known as Al-Alim. He is the knower. Knowledge comes from Him. When we are seeking knowledge, we are there to seek knowledge for Him and for His sake. In this sense, knowledge should be free from any type of strategy which tries to create dhulm in knowledge itself, either making it political, either making it financial, etc. So what I want to discuss is this area. How do these strategies of injustice affect education? And the second point is, how does this affect our madrasas? Now I've done some research of this over the past year and a half. I've just written 1 or 2 articles. There's still research in progress. And what I did in United Kingdom was that I investigated syllabuses in madrasas and the way people teach our children, whether in Shia community, Sunni community, and even within cultures in that community like Khoja, Iraqi, Irani, etc. And I want to share with you this research to show us how perhaps the Shia community at least, and wider Muslim community, is not responding to these trends of injustice. Like, it is not responding to education being commercial or education being political. We are still teaching the same way to our children as we did maybe 50 years ago. So my humble submission to you is we need to perhaps introduce a new model from Nahjul Balagha. So this again is very important because we're dealing with the future of our children. We're dealing with the future of our community. The way in which we want to teach Islam and what Islam means to them. So there are a few things. One is I'm going to give you the general trends of injustice in education, and then especially for us as Muslims, how this affects our madrasas. Salawat, please. Now, I want to just begin with the context of Karbala. Why are we dealing with education? Well, if you noticed yesterday, the heart or the soul, qalb or nafs, which at times is used interchangeably in the Quran according to some scholars, the heart or the soul is a very sensitive place. It's a place by which somebody can be easily influenced by ideas. Now, of course, I'm a new father. My daughter is very young. I'm learning, of course, to be a father. And when you try to teach your child, or if I remember growing up, or I'm an elder brother, for example, so I try to set a good example, let's say, to my brother and sister. When you think back on your life, or when you become a father, and as parents here would attest, teaching a child is a huge responsibility. That child's mind and heart is in your hands. So whatever you do in front of the child copies. Whatever you say, whatever ideas you put in that child's mind, the child will inherit. And when you look at education like that, and you look at all of us growing up, whatever our parents teach us, whatever our community teaches us, whatever we are exposed to in our environment, whatever we see, has a huge effect on our nafs, has a huge effect on our personality, on our identity. So a simple example is, who I am today, right in front of you, is based on a variety of influences. As I've just said, parents, the school I went to, the fact that I grew up in Essex, for example. Now, I always have a chance to change that. Because if I'm always seeking knowledge, then I can always challenge what my parents told me, what I heard in the majalis, what I saw on television. But if I don't seek knowledge, and I just listen to exactly what I heard in the majalis, exactly what my teacher told me, exactly what I learned at school, I'm never going to develop. I'm never going to see was the information that I received, was it correct? I mean, look, I love and respect my parents and my community and all the elders that have taught me. The people that taught me in my community at home. But having now, of course, studied more into religion, researching many things, I can now say to you that a number of things they taught were incorrect, or a number of things they taught were from one perspective only. Now, if I hadn't read many books, and if I hadn't engaged in the study of Islam or law or whatever, I wouldn't have realized these things. And I'm sure, hopefully, all of us can realize that if we are not constantly reading or reflecting about our lives, we will never be able to evaluate whether when somebody gives us information, whether it is correct or not. Now, you and I know, and we discussed this yesterday, so I don't repeat, the Quran is telling us to always to seek knowledge. The Quran is telling us to think and reflect. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا تَفَكُّرُونَ. We have many ahadith from A'imma, which they have told us to always seek knowledge. Our Prophet Muhammad has said it is incumbent on a male and a female to seek knowledge. Male or female to seek knowledge. Jafar Sadiq has said, and this is reported in Al-Kafi, Talibul Ilm Farida. Seeking knowledge is an obligation, is incumbent. Now this is without qualification. It is incumbent on male, female, race, doesn't matter what race or color, we have to seek knowledge. It is indeed the highest ibadah, seeking knowledge. It transcends everything. And what is important is when you analyze that hadith, obligatory is used or obligation is used, like farida, for example. Now that's very interesting, because sometimes when you and I think of what is an obligation in religion, maybe what comes into our mind is salat and Saum and zakat and khums or hajj, jihad, all of these things comes. Sometimes knowledge does not immediately come to our mind, but if you, let's say, turn it around and say, knowledge is an obligation, I have to seek knowledge, maybe we would be spending more time reading books or analyzing and reflecting on ourselves. And we even have many ahadith from the Prophet, from Imam Ali, from the sixth Imam. If you read Al-Kafi, you'll see many hadith where they say the same thing. They say that rituals without comprehension or understanding are valueless. They are meaningless. Because if you pray a 2 rakat namaz, or you're praying your Maghrib and Isha namaz, and you don't understand, or we don't understand who God is, as Imam Ali understood in his life, which I gave the example yesterday, then what value is our namaz? I mean, sometimes we are told, we have to pray out of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or we'll get punished, or we'll have lots of qadha. Fine, of course, we have to love and we have to fear Allah. Nobody disputes that. We have to love Allah because He is Rahman and Rahim. We have to also fear Allah because He is al-adil. He is just. He is just in looking at our actions. He can hold us to account. But we are not doing this salat for Him. We're not doing this salat in the sense that, we want to just please Allah, and when we pass away, Allah will say, oh, you prayed 70 years, this is wonderful. The salat and the Saum is for us. Allah doesn't need our prayers. We have this in the Quran, even in, for example, Dua al-Wida li Shahri Ramadan, in As-Sahifa Sajjadiyah. The fourth Imam begins by saying, I don't have it here, but I'm just remembering the lines. The fourth Imam at the beginning of the dua says, Praise be to you, O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who doesn't need things from His creation. Does Allah need anything from us? He's needless. So when we pray, sometimes we may have a mentality, Alhamdulillah, I've done my salat, so when I go back to Allah, I can say, look, I prayed, I fulfilled all my salat. But maybe Allah will ask us this question, well, that's very nice that you've prayed, but what benefit did it have on you? Did it change you? Did you get to know me? Sometimes the most valuable thing is a reflection and gaining knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is why knowledge is emphasized in the religion. Now, with that context, training of the heart becomes important. Because if we are not seeking knowledge, how can we remove ignorance about ourselves and about each other? The amount of namaz and fasting that I do will not make any difference to the way I look at you or the way I look at myself. But if I pray with knowledge, or if I'm leading my life with knowledge, I will be able to understand my bad habits and good habits and the way that I treat you. Perhaps many relationships are destroyed, that is in the community and outside of the community, because of ignorance of ourselves. I might offend you, for example, right? And I always ask forgiveness in the lectures. I always say at the end or at the start of the lectures, please forgive me for my shortcomings, always, because I don't know if I've offended you or not. But I have to have a realization that my actions are going to have a negative effect. Now, this idea of ignorance of the heart, we can see this in Karbala. I want to just relate to you something. This is recorded in Ayam Shia, okay? Now, this is just before Imam Hussein al-Islam was killed. Just listen to these words, and you'll see how what I'm saying about knowledge and heart becomes very important, okay? Just before Imam Hussein al-Islam was being killed, the Imam asked for a sip of water, to which an enemy standing over him said, "You will not taste water until you are given the burning water of hell." Then Imam Hussein al-Islam says, "Nay, I will proceed to my grandfather, the Messenger of Allah, and drink from the fountain of paradise. And to him I will complain of your evil actions," Hussein al-Islam says. But the words of the Imam had no effect upon them. It was as though their hearts had become hardened. and all traces of rahmah, of mercy, had been removed from the enemy's hearts. Umar ibn Sa'ad turned to his right and said to a soldier, "Finish off Al-Hussein alayhi salam." According to another report, he just said, "Go and behead and cut the head of Hussein alayhi salam." Okay? I know it is sad. Of course, my heart feels sad when reading this. The reason I'm sharing this with you is because the only difference between you and I, the only difference between us and extremists, between those people that go to war, is the cultivation of heart, is the cultivation of ilm, of knowledge, to remove ignorance so that our blindness does not lead us to commit destructive actions. Now in Karbala, although we talk about battlefield and martyrdom, the battlefield was in the heart essentially. It was a battle of hearts. This is exactly the battle that Hur engaged in before coming to Al-Hussein al-Islam. He was examining his heart. What is therefore important to us as Muslims? I mean, we can talk about all human beings, but as Muslims, that care for our children, that care for our youths. I mean, you can see I'm not that old, and I'm sharing with you my experiences as somebody born in the United Kingdom and growing up. What I have found important in my life is the way that I was trained, is the way that I was taught, whether I was taught how to pray in a valuable way, or whether I was taught how to pray in a legal way. Legal way means, as long as I've done my niyat and takbiratul ihram and qiyam and ruku and sajda, my namaz is accepted. But what happens if that's not the acceptance of salat? What happens that's just a formal and legal salat? The real salat, and I have a quote here from Imam Zain al-Abidin al-Islam, the real salat is the salat which the fourth Imam explains, which is the humility, which is that sense of debasing ourselves in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is how we should teach our children, for example. So you can see that training the heart to love Allah and appreciate mercy is very, very crucial. Salawat. So first of all, how do we explain this kind of concept of spiritual education? This is the topic. How do I spiritually train students in madrasa? How do we spiritually train ourselves? For example, do we know how to pray in a valuable manner? Do we know how to ask for dua? I mean, we pray dua, but if you read many ahadith from Al-Kafi and other compilations, there is actually a structure of how to do dua. There is, for example, a sense of praising Allah and doing salawat and doing many other things. There is actually 5 or 6 principles which the Imam lays out. Now this requires another lecture. Spiritual education, which is the topic of this lecture, is the way in which we can train each other's hearts to love Allah, to lead our life in a meaningful way, to build relationships with each other which are harmonious and reflect a godly existence, and to have knowledge of the techniques that enable us to understand ourselves. And understand ourselves in relation to God, in relation to society, and in relation to myself. That doesn't just mean knowing how to pray. It also means knowing how to be merciful, knowing how to be kind, knowing how to be empathetic, knowing how to be creative, knowing how to reflect, knowing how to be inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We all have the right to receive ilham. The Prophet receives wahi, which is a revelation, okay? And he has the right, according to Allah, to receive the Quran. Now, we might not be prophets, but we have the right to receive ilham. We have the right to be inspired. Many of our scholars are inspired. Now, how do I receive inspiration from Allah? How do I come up with a good idea? How do I remove impurity from my heart? This all requires training. We are trained how to run businesses. We are even trained how to pray salat in terms of the conditions. If, for example, I move away from the qibla, or I start laughing intentionally, my salat is broken. Everybody knows this. But is my salat broken if my heart now is thinking of other things? Yes, you can say that spiritually your salat is broken. But we would ignore it and say, look, I've prayed my salat, it's accepted by God. But the reality is, if we read the ahadith, you'll find that there is as much, if not more, emphasis on this spiritual training as well of the salat. So, when it comes to spiritual education, what I'm submitting to you is this now is a very important system for us to examine. Non-Muslims are examining this now, and I gave you the study, I think in the Friday lecture, that UCLA did that study between 2003 to 2010, and it's the only study of its kind to my knowledge, where they examined many colleges across North America, and they came to the conclusion that so many teachers and students want to know how to become spiritual. So this is now, non-Muslims are also now trying to examine this, and Christians are trying to reinvigorate their own churches and other religions of how to become spiritual. And for Muslims, as you and I know, it's not easy sometimes to raise children or to live in a Western society, and I don't say that negatively, I just mean that what we're exposed to, it's a very free society. You look at the television, you look at billboards. Of course, people dress freely here, we know that, right? There are pubs and there are clubs. So it's, these things are very easily accessible to people. So with that pressure and that challenge, how do you maintain that respect for, of course, the society that we have? We are afforded many good rights and freedoms, but also how do you maintain a balance that you can also respect and follow the dictates and the principles that we have within Islam? This is the key challenge for us today, and maybe it has always been there. In order for us to appreciate this, we have to appreciate two things. We have to appreciate Nahj al-Balagha, which I mentioned yesterday, and we have to understand these strategies of injustice. Salawat. Now, yesterday, I relate to you that, if you agree with me, Nahj al-Balagha has been ignored within our Islamic society, within Muslim societies. The other problem is, how do we read Nahj al-Balagha? I mean, when we open the book, of course, we should read the sermons. But what was the purpose of Nahj al-Balagha? This is very important. It's okay to quote from Nahj al-Balagha. I read this in Nahj al-Balagha. But what was the intention of the compiler, Sharif al-Radhi? What was his intention in compiling Nahj al-Balagha? Let me just share with you some of his own words, which may clarify this question, okay? He said in his introduction, he says, the object of this compilation is that I should bring forth Amir al-Mu'mineen's greatness and superiority in the art of rhetoric, which is in addition to his countless qualities and innumerable distinctions, and to show that he has risen to the highest pinnacle of this attainment, is singular amongst all those predecessors whose utterance are quoted here and there, whereas his own sayings or utterances are like an onrushing and irresistible stream, and such a treasure of subtleties in language is unmatched. What was he trying to do? He was trying to show the fadail of Imam al-Islam, but you may also say he was trying to inspire us with the personality of Imam al-Islam. If it wasn't for Sharif al-Radhi, we would not know the thinking of Imam al-Islam. So we have to appreciate and value that Nahj al-Balagha is a book of inspiration for us. It's a book of literature. Shakespeare is valued, okay, in English history, in Western societies, it's valued. But as I've posed you this question, do we value our Nahj al-Balagha like other people value Shakespeare? I would argue we don't value Nahj al-Balagha, because if we did, we would teach it in madrasa. I don't think I found a curriculum that teaches Nahj al-Balagha or as-Sayf as-Sajjadiyya. And every person that you meet will say, oh, but after the Quran, Nahj al-Balagha or as-Sayf as-Sajjadiyya. Always we will say that. But we never read it or use it. So it's very strange that it's not within our mentality to use it. And maybe that's because we have not appreciated its purpose. If a child reads Harry Potter, right? It's very easy to appreciate the purpose of Harry Potter. It's there to take you into a fantasy land. It's there to inspire you and to make you dream and to make you imagine of these things. Well, fine, this is fictional works. Nahjul Balagha has that same quality if we are able to appreciate the far-sightedness of the Imam. The second thing is, again, I don't want to read this quote because we have lack of time, is that he does say in the introduction, Sharif al-Radi, that he has not compiled everything about Imam Ali in Nahjul Balagha. He may have left certain things out. This is a very clear admission of his. So what our other scholars have done, and we must owe great respect to our Shia scholars, is that they have actually looked at the chains of transmission of where the sermons have come from. So most of what we see in Nahjul Balagha now, and because of the efforts of scholars, you can see that, okay, this sermon came from this compilation, etc., etc. So we can also try to rely on some of the sermons. Still, a few of the du'as and sermons we don't know where they are from, right? So you can't say everything in Nahjul Balagha is authentic. Maybe a few things we still have to investigate. But alhamdulillah, many things we have the sources for. So what we at least must appreciate is that even if we can't find the source of that sermon or hadith, you can see the balagha. And that balagha could not have come from anyone else than our first Imam. This is something for us to appreciate. Now we come on to these trends. If we are serious about using Nahjul Balagha, what are the trends of injustice? And there are a few I want to give you. Now, according to my knowledge, there are three. Commercialization in education, politicization, and secularization. And let me just explain this to you. On my plane journey here, in the movie section and all that, I was just browsing through, and in the documentary section, there was one very important documentary which we should actually look at, which is, there is a recent documentary called The Ivory Tower. The Ivory Tower, and I advise you to look at that. This documentary is about the state of North American education and the way in which education now is being controlled by corporate interests. Education is no longer that sense of free search for knowledge. Students, as you know, in UK and America have to pay high fees, right? They have huge debts. They may not be able to find a job afterwards. And that sense of studying education for the sake of knowledge is now pretty much non-existent in UK and American education. We're actually going through a huge crisis. That's why you have, what is it, that movement, Occupy movement, right? You have Occupy movement that's in UK and America, and now it's also spreading. So students are dissatisfied. Now, I completed my PhD a year and a half ago, so I've just come out of that system of 10 years. And I'm telling you very honestly that I felt those effects. I saw how education changed. Even the students here, maybe who are going to university or have just come out, you know, there is a huge crisis because there's an apathy. People are not learning. They are disconnected from their professors. You know, that sense of spending time with teachers and learning from them is gone. You know, and I'm going to share with you evidence with that. But what we must realize is that our mind is being nurtured to think that education is only commercial. So we only think that education is for us to get a job. So what happens is, we stop learning. And how many of us have continued to learn after our madrasa or after our degree? Do we read books? And how often do we read books? I mean, for example, I gave some workshops in Sydney about Islamophobia and terrorism. Now, I'm giving these workshops and that's fine. I don't mind doing that. But really, you and I should be educated in what Islamophobia and terrorism is. We should be reading books about these things. We should be aware of books which are coming out, which are explaining these things to us. One book which I recommend you to read is by Arun Kundnani. Arun Kundnani has written a book called The Muslims Are Coming. It's one of the greatest books I've read about Islamophobia and terrorism. And he also explains the trends of what's happening in the government and maybe what will happen to us in future years. All Muslims have to be aware of this. I began the first 4 lectures saying that my humble submission is the Muslim community is fundamentally unaware of how to respond to Islamophobia and terrorism. We don't know how to do it. Why? Because we don't read. We are not reading people. We are not aware of what's happening internally within international law, what's infiltrations within the community. We are not aware of these things. And because we are not aware, our hearts are blind of how to respond. So what's happening with commercialization of education is we are nurtured to think, well, I'm going to work, I make my money, and I go home and I go to sleep. But really, we should be leaders of knowledge. So commercialization is very, very dangerous, right? There are just two quotes I want to share with you, and they are really nice quotes. One is by Professor Kostas Douzinas, who I've been quoting. He says, like many others, I believe that it is the time for intellectuals and academics to join the wider political and cultural debates and conflicts and bring whatever limited insights disciplinary knowledge offers to the task of imagining and working for a better world. Too often we academics have opted for a life of accommodation and non-confrontation, looking to the next promotion or book contract. Too often has the university slavishly served the demands of state, nation and ideology. And yet the prime mission of the university remains the quest for knowledge and truth. As we know since Socrates, knowledge and truth are inseparable partners of justice and beauty. Truth and knowledge are wedded to justice. Speaking truth with justice to power is the name and honor of the European University. It's a very beautiful quote. What he's saying, and I've seen this, so I'm giving you honest experiences. University scholars, most professors, to be honest, are concerned about writing the next book, making money, publishing a journal article. They don't care what happens in the community and society. This I'm telling you direct. We had a meeting today at the University of Seattle. We met with a very lovely professor there. He said the same thing. Most professors in universities don't care about poverty. They don't care about improving society. And he, as a professor, is telling us this. So there is now a separation between the intellectual and the grassroots, and you and I, laymen, okay? Second is, the Muslim society is also suffering the same thing, okay? We are not free from this, right? Ali Shariati, who I'm sure my elders know, and my fellow Iranians would know this better than me, in one of his lectures, Mission of a Free Thinker, he said a very similar thing. Just look at what he said. He said, any school which is not based upon the cultural foundations of a society looks like a good book in a library, which is used only by a small group of students and professors. Even if thousands of such books are printed, they will have no effect upon the masses. The greatest danger is the self-separation of the free thinker from the society's context. If a free thinker separates himself from his society, no matter where he goes or what he does, his society will remain in everlasting corruption. Everlasting corruption. For example, in the 5th and 6th centuries AH, thinkers such as Avicenna, that is Ibn Sina, Ghazali, two of history's greatest teachers, died in a society which was wallowing in the corruption in the Seljuk and Ghaznavi periods. Why? Why did this happen? Because these free thinkers stayed away from the society. Then he says something very bold. Consequently, we would have been better off if in place of Ibn Sina, Ghazali, Fakhruddin Razi and Zakaria Razi, we had one Abu Dhar, just one Abu Dhar. If we had one Abu Dhar, all the Islamic societies would have been saved from the grips of Seljuk, Ghaznavi and the Mongols. I mean, this is very bold for him to say that, because many Muslim scholars and students respect Ibn Sina and Ghazali. I mean, of course, I respect the contribution as well. What he's saying is very insightful, and it's the same thing that Professor Kostas Douzinas is saying, is that real knowledge is exactly what Imam al-Islam said. He says, knowledge is what you learn and what comes in your heart, then what you express in your tongue, and what you act out. This is knowledge. If I read a book and I'm writing lots of things and I don't implement it, that's not knowledge. I'm half-baked. I'm only learned 50%. The real knowledge is implementation, is being with the community, is understanding people's problems. Now in the first 4 lectures, I gave you some facts and figures. Why is it that the money that we may give to Iraq and Palestine is 80% of it doesn't reach? Why is it that there's huge corruption in Iraq and huge corruption in Palestine? Why is it that Shahid Mutahari was criticizing the administration of Khums? Because, as he himself saw, as Ali Shariati admits, because many scholars are not concerned with the problems in society, in building institutions and improving our organizations and administrations. We suffer from corruption. We have to admit this. Muslim societies suffer from corruption. And many Muslim scholars are not concerned with organization and administration. This is a fact. There is no controversy or debate here. This is a fact. Because otherwise, our money would be reaching. And not only that, we would know where our money would go. So I'm saying this again to you, that when you talk about education, you have to have a proximity, a closeness between a scholar and the problems on the ground. So that when you are writing and gaining knowledge, you're also trying to say, well, why am I studying and what's the purpose of writing? It's to answer people's problems. Look, we have huge levels of poverty, Muslim poverty, right? We have people on the streets. Shouldn't we create institutions or come up with ideas or community self-help programs to get these problems off the street, to get these people off the street? Look, we have Ramadan in Muharram. And I've said this in lectures in UK. Just take the example of Ramadan, a simple example I'm giving you, and I'll use the proof of fourth Imam as well. In Ramadan, many mosques have iftar every day. And you'll always have on the websites, please can you donate X amount of money, because we want to have iftar every day, right? Now, as you and I do, we attend the programs. I rarely see any non-Muslim coming into our program, right? Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm giving you honest experience. Non-Muslims do not come to our Ramadan programs. Yes? Do you agree with me? Yes?
Sometimes.
Huh? Sometimes. Okay, maybe here in Iman Center. Okay. In many places, they generally don't come every day. It's not like you have, for every 100 Muslims, you're not going to have 100 non-Muslims, right? It's not equal or anything, okay? Now, why is this the case? What's happened, right? If you read the dua for the beginning of Ramadan, in As-Sahifa Sajadiyah, a dua that we don't really recite. We will always recite dua al-iftitah every day. Although we should recite other duas to learn and understand what they mean. In this dua, which I think is dua number 40 or 41, our fourth Imam, lays out the vision of Ramadan. It's so beautiful. He was really far-sighted. What he says that Ramadan is the month in which people give gifts to each other, in which people build ties with each other, in which if you have destroyed a relationship, you go and find that person and you rebuild that relationship. Ramadan is the month in which you feed the poor. Ramadan is the month in which you are loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which the society is elevated. Now I've just given you a summary. Now he deals with the fiqh of Ramadan as well, but then he deals with the social aspect of Ramadan. The vision of Ramadan is to cater not just for Muslims, but for society. It's to get people off the street. It's to feed people. It's to make people's lives better. Now, if you had scholars and thinkers working on how we can change Ramadan programs and build institutions to realize this vision of the fourth Imam, we would not have poverty. Because you have the institution of Ramadan, which is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a gift from the Prophet. But we don't use it. We cater for ourselves. Hence, the problem or the reason why this is happening is because there is a separation between what is happening in the intellectual world, Muslim or non-Muslim, and what is happening on the ground. Salawat. The second trend is called Euro-Americanism, or Eurocentrism, or Euro-Americanism. What this means is that knowledge comes from this perspective only, which is the knowledge or the worldview of Europeans and Americans. Now this is really dangerous, actually, this one, because the way you and I think about life, I mean, is basically very much influenced by a European system of knowledge and American system of knowledge, right? So that means the way we may look at charity, the way we may look at religion itself even, the way we may look at society, everything, the way we run our family, everything that we do is influenced predominantly by that, because we live in this environment, right? Now, of course, I'm not saying everything is bad. There are positives to this. But there are also huge negatives, because when you talk about, and this is exactly to do with the four lectures, when you talk about the way Muslims are responding to Islamophobia and terrorism, it's because we've basically been colonized. That's the reason. And I'm going to give you some facts and figures in the next two lectures. But there is a scholar who I'm in touch with who is from Iran, from University of Tehran, Sayyid Raza Amali, and he's done a study on this basically. And he says that Muslims don't realize the fact that whenever they want to produce knowledge or respond to problems, they're responding from the perspective of a European and American. They're not responding necessarily from their own culture and religion. They're not creating things, right? Okay? So when we talk about responding to things, what's happening is that our mind is colonized, right? Now just some examples. There is a movement in India and Malaysia about this, and it's called the Multiversity Project. Multiversity Project, you can look at it online. And they're introducing a different kind of university. They're not just teaching English literature, right? Or British history or American history. These are things that I learned. I didn't learn my own history. So you can see how colonization happens, right? So they are introducing the following subjects. Academic studies, modern science criticism, Europology, that means how kind of, how Europe controls society or analyzes societies, colonial structures and laws, the West and violence. So now, you know how they say Islam and violence. They've introduced a new module, West and violence. How does the West promote violence? What strategies does it use? Which I talked about, international and human rights. Relinking the countries around the Indian Ocean and investigating Western societies. Now, if you look at many universities today in UK and America, and you look at Islamic studies departments, you'll always have a module or always have a subject called Islamic societies or societies in Islam, or Muslim diaspora, or the study of Islam and Muslim communities. We are investigated all the time. Students study us because we are a subject to be studied. We're like that fish in a bowl. That's how people look at us. We have not even created a subject to say, well, let's study the West. Let's study how people live. They don't live in a perfect way. They've got problems. Let's analyze these problems. Let's try to remove those problems. Let's try to solve those problems, right? So we don't come up with these things, but I'm trying to tell you there is a movement now to this. So when you talk about education, the politicization of education can also be dangerous. And the last trend is secular education. Now, I have grown up within a secular education environment, but I also went to 2 Christian schools, and obviously going to Hausa. So I've seen the benefit and negative of secular education and religious education. The biggest problem is that secular education, by and large, says that you cannot study religion in the classroom. There must be a separation between secularity and spirituality, or secular education and religion. So what happens is, and you can see this today, is our children, and I myself went through this, is you go to school and university and you think that religion remains in the mosque, right? And outside, I don't have to practice my religion. Madrasa is something extra, and university is the main thing. My school homework is more important than understanding the biography of Imam Ali. This I hope is a fact, right? The child's mind or the young person's mind thinks in dichotomy, in division. And that's the effect of secular education, to make us have a dual personality, right? I won't pray in school, I won't pray at the workplace. I'll just quickly, I'll come home and pray, I'll make my namaz qada. See, this is the effect on us. So what is very important for us is to have a harmonious and stable identity. We don't want conflict in our lives. We don't want conflict in the heart. We want to be confident Muslims and ultimately confident citizens. We don't want a conflict between the two. Salawat. Now, how have we responded to this, right? We have, as Muslims so far, we have responded to this through the element of protection. Now, I analyze this, and again, this I'm giving you the example of UK, right? So I'm not an expert in, obviously, American Muslim migration, but in UK, maybe it's similar. When Muslims migrated in the 1950s, Muslims wanted to protect their culture, right? Which is a very obvious argument. They wanted to protect their culture, so they started to build masjids and madaris, and they said, right, you know what? Our children don't know how to pray, or people are drinking alcohol here. This is a new environment. Let's teach our children how to do wudu, pray salat. You know, we want to give lectures on the imams and their lives and their history, and this is wonderful, right? So the view was to protect all the time. So you make sure people remain within the masjid, you teach them the culture so that they are protected from the secular culture. And I think that is fine, and there's a merit to that, and alhamdulillah, I wouldn't be speaking to you about this today if it wasn't for the contribution of our Muslim elders in building masjids, right? May Allah bless them. However, you fast forward now to 2015, the world view should never be to protect. You can't protect now. We live in an internet and social media society. A young child will go on Google and get the information. A young child is going to be exposed. You can't protect him. But what we can do is educate him, is give him critical faculties, is nurture his mind to think for himself or herself. Now, as many elders that I speak to from many cultures, is our children are asking, well, why do we have to pray? Why am I a Muslim? Why am I a Shia Ithna Shari as opposed to an Ismaili or something else? Why am I not a Christian or Jew? How are Hindus, Jews, Christians, Muslims the same, or how are they different? These are now the questions. Because people want to know why. And this is a wonderful thing. We cannot believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without asking why. You know, that makes us a good Muslim. So we should encourage the questions. We should never remove those questions, right? Now, if the culture is to nurture and criticize, then what we have to do is we have to set up the educational framework and the system to allow that to happen. We have to do that. Now, from my research, when I examined Shia and Sunni madaris in the United Kingdom, I found they teach the same syllabus, which is, we teach fiqh, akhlaq, tariq, and tajweed. This is how I learned, and maybe this is how you learned, or some variation, right? Fiqh, akhlaq, tariq, and tajweed. Now this is how we have divided Islam. Of course, you can divide Islam further if you want. You can say irfan. We don't teach irfan generally. We don't teach tafsir, okay? We may not teach other subjects. So we have been teaching this division. Now, as I said, there has been a merit to this division, because look, I wouldn't be able to know how to pray if my dear elders did not teach me in the fiqh, right? The problem is, now, my humble research tells me, and my experience, is that division is causing a problem, because it's producing a narrow-minded student. So I want to give you an example. If you only teach fiqh to a child, and you teach him, look, you know, if you, for example, forget a sajda, right? Or you miss out tashahhud, and you have to do sajda to saw, okay? And you have to do, after the namaz, you do 2 sajdas, for example, right? If you teach him this is good, okay? Because you're teaching him or her how to rectify the problem. However, we are not teaching him how to value the salat. So many children may feel, I'm not feeling a connection with Allah. Look, let us be honest. On a day-to-day basis, do you and I feel a beautiful connection with Allah in our prayer? To the extent that nobody should remove us from the salat. That if we heard a noise or anything, we would still remain still. We have that level of contentment where we feel we're elevated. We feel we are in a different realm. Do we have this feeling? If we don't have this feeling, and my experience, at least with youths, is they generally don't have this feeling, is because they are only taught the legal side. Let me just give you proof of this, alright? The 4th Imam says something very beautiful in Risalat al-Hukuk about the right of Salat. He says, the right of your ritual prayer is that you know that it is an arrival before Allah. You're arriving before God. And that through it, you are standing before Him. When you know that, then you will stand in the station of Him who is lowly, vile, beseeching, trembling, hopeful, fearful, and abased. And you will magnify Him, that is Allah, who is before you through stillness and dignity. You will approach the prayers with your heart, and you will perform it according to its bounds and rights. If you have followed this quote, he's teaching the reverse. He mentions limits and rights at the end of the hadith. We do the opposite, right? We want to make sure that the children knows the conditions and legal rights before he or she even understands how to stand. You know, how to stand in salat, we have to learn this. How do I stand in front of God? Okay, I'm standing like this, right? But what should my heart feel? You know, what kind of state should I be in qiyam? When I go into ruku, what am I feeling? Does my mind make a transition? Does my heart make a transition? These are things that we have to learn. And the fourth Imam is teaching this. But my submission to you is, we do not teach this. So what I'm finding is the division of fiqh, akhlaq, tariq, and tajweed now is causing a bit of a problem. Because if you only teach that, then you're missing out a huge aspect of Islam. Akhlaq, for example, is taught as just a hadith. But it's not taught in a cohesive way to learn from the holistic personality of Imam Ali. How would Imam Ali be relevant in 2014? Okay, I know that he was brave and he was just, and I'm going to learn hadith in akhlaq of that. But how is he relevant in 2014 to me on a day-to-day basis? That's what you have to teach in akhlaq. In tariq, what do? And I feel sorry for the students that we teach them so many dates. And so many students come to me saying, I can't remember all the dates. It's okay. No need to remember the dates. I make mistakes on the dates. And I'm telling you this. It's not important at all. What is important is that I understand that in this date and in this incident, there is a moral to be learnt, and I can tie together why this historical incident happened. That's more important. To understand the goal of history, right? To understand the trend of history. To understand now, if Muslims were in this position in Abu Bakr's time, for example, or in Imam Ali's time, then what position should they be in this time? That's the purpose of history. We learn from history, right? And tajweed, as I said in yesterday's lecture, we don't teach the meaning and the content of the Quran. So what's happening is, we are not giving the intellectual and spiritual tools to our students, if you agree with me. Now I'm telling you this is somebody born in UK, right? So I realized this after kind of 30 years, that I praise my elders, but I wish we had come up with a system before that where we could have had a balance, right? So that, now I may be hopefully finding meaning in my salat, but when I was 15 or 20 or 25, I didn't find meaning. And now, for example, that I'm a father, I would like to train my child as young as possible, not to overload her, but at least when she understands that, right, she's praying salat in a beautiful way. I don't care if she makes lots of mistakes, it doesn't matter. What is important is that after the salat, she can say, Dad, Mom, you know what, today I felt close to God. I felt love for God. I am now feeling the love that Imam Ali felt for God. Don't we want that from our children? Don't we want that from ourselves? This is how Imam Ali trained Imam Hassan al-Islam and Mohsen. This is how he trained them. And I want to give you proof for that. Salawat. I'll just deal with that briefly because, I don't want to take too much time. I didn't realize that there was a lot to cover. But there is a letter which you all know, which is the letter which Imam Ali wrote just before his death, right? Sometimes known as letter 31, or depending which number you go by. It's a letter that he wrote to Imam Hassan or Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, depending on historical reports. The research which I have done, basically I'm saying is that this letter can provide a very good template for madrasas now in the Shia community and in wider Muslim community, it can provide a template for us to develop a new vision for madrasas and a new vision for spiritual education. So it's not about forgetting fiqh or akhlaq or history or tajweed. We don't want to forget those subjects. But it's about broadening those subjects and putting them in the right place, right? And this letter gives us that. Let me quote you several principles that I kind of extracted, and you may even extract more, but these I think are 7 very important principles which can be the basis of a madrasa vision statement. So that, if for example a teacher teaches the class, they would know what to impart to the student. They would know that the end goal of a madrasa is to produce this type of student. So for example, today we know that a company or a business firm or a law firm wants a lawyer or a businessman skilled in A, B, C, D. When you get a job description, you know that, okay, you have to get skill A, B, C, D, E. We have to produce that for our madrasas. So we know by the end of it that we have been successful, right? This is how Imam Ali begins. He says, "Indeed, I advise you to be conscious of Allah, fulfill His commands, fill your heart with His remembrance, and cling to His rope. For the rope is more trustworthy than any rope between you and God, provided you take it. Enliven your heart with exhortations. Observe the misfortunes of this world. Fear the authority of time, the way that the nights and days change. Recall the events of the past and what happened to people before you." What is he saying? He's educating his sons on the fact, live in society, observe society, and actually try to understand what happened in society. He's not saying, just study religion, just study Quran, just study fiqh. You read the beginning of the letter, and he's saying, understand the world, live in the world. In madrasa, we have to introduce subjects which are to do with the world. Whether it's now terrorism or Islamophobia, whether it's American history, whether it's poetry, we have to introduce subjects which actually relate to people's lives. That's what Imam Ali is saying. Don't make a division between secular and spiritual. There's no such thing. It's all one. We have to live in society. Some things religion has a control over. Other things it's got nothing to do with religion. If you examine the many narrations at the end of Nahj al-Balagha, many of the hadith have got nothing to do with religion, nothing. Imam Ali, for example, says, I can't remember the hadith, I just remember. He says, if you worry too much, if you grieve too much, half your age is taken away. Right? Half your age is taken away. That's got nothing to do with religion. That's just to do with life. That's to do with living. So Imam Ali is teaching us how to be a good human being and just how to live our life in a very happy manner. So we have to teach these psychological things. A second thing is that Imam Ali says that we should ponder over our problems and deeply understand them. He says, if your soul refuses to accept my advice without gaining knowledge, then know that your search for that should be with understanding and learning, not with the entanglement of doubts and trapping of quarrels. What is he saying? He's saying that to his son, look, I'm just giving you advice. Now this is the Imam saying to another Imam. He's saying, I'm just giving you advice. You don't have to accept it. But if you don't accept my advice, imagine Imam Ali saying this to his sons. If you don't accept my advice, then gain knowledge on whatever you are doing and do not make a decision that is full of doubts. Be certain. Muslims have to be confident and decisive people. We should not be people that engage in lots of doubts. As I said, I just came from Sydney, and many people ask for istikhara, right? For everything, every small thing. But istikhara just means seeking goodness. And istikhara originally did not mean you open the Quran and do istikhara that way. Istikhara just meant dua. You just say, oh Allah, I'm suffering from a problem, I have confusion in my life, can you guide me? And then you find some certainty, you act upon it, that's istikhara, finish. That's what it is. Istikhara is meant to be a very last resort. So Muslims and Shias have to be very confident about their life and about their decisions. One or two other things and then I'll end, and I'll probably continue this tomorrow, okay? Imam Ali then talks about how a person should rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and actually try to supplicate to Him with absolute love, to the extent that we should never feel that the door of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closed on us. Imam Ali teaches his sons to always go to Allah first, even before parents. If we teach our children, look, you have a problem, you can come to me. I'm your mom, I'm your dad, and mom is here for you. Your uncle is here, community is here. But first, go and ask Allah. Go and pray. Go and just think. Go and see what Allah would like of you. You know, there is so much beauty and hidden treasures given out of reflection. When we talk about a meaningful relationship with Allah, we also have to teach ourselves and our children how to run to Allah to any problem. Salawat. Now, I've just dealt with a few, and inshallah I will try to recount those principles in the future lectures, okay? But I just wanted to give you a glimpse that in this letter we have the basis of perhaps changing our division and improving our vision statements to actually come up with principles that are very enduring and long-term for us. Then we would produce students that are very rounded and balanced. They would respect the law, but they would also have this very beautiful internal dimension. Jazakallah for your patience. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. When I was just reading the Maktal today before the lecture, my heart became very sad, because in this Maktal and during the journey of Karbala, Lady Zainab, salamullahi alayha, is losing the apple of her eyes, her two children, On and Muhammad. And it is reported that Abdullah, their father, can we dim the lights? Abdullah, On and Muhammad's father, was too ill, was too sick to fight. But he says something very, very heartfelt. He tells his wife, Lady Zainab, he says, "My dear wife, I cannot fight, but please go and tell your brother Hussein alayhi salam that I'm willing to send my children, I'm willing to send these youngsters into battle. Should Hussein alayhi salam need them, should the time be alright, please go and send them." Can you imagine a father saying this? Can you imagine Lady Zainab salamullahi alayha's heart? There are mothers here. You know, people love their children. We love our children. We don't want anything to happen to them. If there are children in the audience, if there are youngsters in the audience, we are very lucky to live this long. In Karbala, how many youngsters were martyred? Or how many youngsters saw terrible and horrific things? What happened to Sakina, peace be upon her? What happened to her when she was tortured? She was waiting for water. She told her father, "Where is my uncle Abbas? He has not brought me water, I'm waiting for him." And now look at these children, thirsty and brave. And they are, of course, the apple of her mother's eyes. On the day of Ashura, Lady Zainab dressed On and Muhammad in new garments. Then she handed them their swords and presented them to her brother Hussein alayhi salam for permission to fight. What did the Imam say? Imam said, "Abdullah, your husband may not agree to this." Hussein alayhi salam was reluctant. Of course, why does he want his family to be martyred just like that? He wants to save his children. He wants to protect the camp. He doesn't want anything to happen to his sister. He doesn't want anything to happen to his nephews. He loves them. And yet, what was the love of these children? What was the love of Zainab for her brother? Zainab salamullahi alayha says, "But Abdullah is the one who instructed me that in the case of war, I should give his sons before yours." And Imam agreed. When Umar ibn Sa'd saw the two children riding into battle, He said, what love Zainab must have for her brother to have sent the lights of her eyes to the battlefield. The two children fought until Muhammad was struck down. Owen came to his dying brother, taking him into his lap. He said, "Oh brother, please don't cry, don't grieve. I too will soon follow." Owen continued to fight until he too was struck down and departed to the Akhirah. Weeping and crying, the Imam was overcome with grief. Seeing this, he carried them away with their bodies in his arms, and Owen and Muhammad's feet were dragging on the ground. When the bodies of the martyrs, when the bodies of Owen and Muhammad were brought to the tent, what did Lady Zainab do? Did she cry and did she wail? Reports say that she did not cry, that she kept her tears close to her heart. Were she to cry as any mother would, the morale of the camp would have gone perhaps. All mothers would cry for their children. But Lady Zainab's strength was that she did not cry. But can we imagine the suffering that Lady Zainab felt? What mother would not cry? Imagine the tears that she was holding in her heart, the anguish and the grief that she felt in her heart for her children. When the news reached Abdullah, Abdullah says, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." He said, "Praise be to Allah who allowed my sons, my dear Owen and Muhammad, to attain the rank of martyrdom alongside Hussein. But if only I had been with them and been killed before them, by Allah, I told them to die for Hussein. And now, me as a father, I am left alone crying, and I cannot see my children anymore. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." Ma'atam al-Hussein. Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.